The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning. Not a dramatic sign. Not a heart attack. Not a divorce. Not a bankruptcy. Just a coffee cup. Daniel Mercer stared at the white ceramic mug in his kitchen and realized he couldn't remember buying it. He turned it in his hands. A small chip near the handle. The faded logo of a hardware store that had gone out of business years ago. He looked around the kitchen of the suburban Ohio home he'd lived in for nearly 3 decades and felt something strange. Everything was familiar, yet nothing felt connected to him. The refrigerator hummed quietly. Rain tapped against the window. The clock above the stove clicked towards 6:17 a.m., and Daniel felt like a guest in his own life. At 60 years old, he should have been satisfied. At least that's what everyone said. He had retired from a manufacturing company after 37 years. He owned his home outright. His son was successful. His daughter had a family of her own. There was money in the bank. No major health problems. No obvious crisis. From the outside, Daniel Mercer had won. So why did every morning feel heavier than the last? He set the mug down. The coffee suddenly tasted bitter. Across the room sat an empty chair. For 2 years, the chair had remained empty. His wife Susan used to sit there. Every morning, every breakfast, every argument, every laugh. 40 years together, then cancer, then hospitals, then silence. The loss had devastated him, but grief wasn't the whole story. Daniel knew that. The emptiness he felt had existed long before Susan died. He just hadn't noticed it, because life had always been busy. Work, mortgage payments, children, responsibilities, deadlines. There was always something demanding his attention. Now there was only time, and time had become dangerous, because time allowed questions. Questions he had spent decades avoiding. The phone buzzed. A text from his daughter. "Don't forget Emma's soccer game Saturday." Daniel smiled faintly. His granddaughter, one of the few things that still brought light into his days. He typed back, "Wouldn't miss it." Then he stared at the screen. His daughter lived only 30 minutes away, yet sometimes weeks passed without seeing her. Not because she didn't care, not because he didn't care. Life simply drifted. The same way friendships drifted. The same way marriages drifted. The same way entire decades disappeared. He slipped the phone into his pocket. The house suddenly felt too quiet, so he grabbed his jacket and drove. No destination, just movement. Rain streaked across the windshield as familiar streets passed by. The grocery store, the bank, the church where Susan's funeral had been held. Places he'd visited thousands of times. Places that should have felt meaningful. Instead, they felt like scenery from a movie he'd watched too many times. Eventually, he found himself parked beside a small lake on the edge of town. The rain had stopped. Gray clouds hung low over the water. An elderly man sat alone on a nearby bench feeding ducks. Daniel recognized him immediately. Frank Holloway, a former co-worker. They hadn't spoken in years. Frank noticed him and waved. "Daniel Mercer." Daniel walked over. "Frank." The old man smiled. "You retired yet?" Daniel laughed softly. "Almost 3 years now." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Then why do you look like somebody just told you bad news?" The question caught Daniel off guard. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Frank chuckled. "Thought so." They sat together in silence for a moment, watching ripples spread across the lake. Then Frank said something Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. "You know what most people get wrong about happiness?" Daniel shrugged. "What?" Frank tossed another piece of bread toward the ducks. "They spend their whole lives chasing obligations and call it purpose." Daniel frowned. Frank continued. "They wake up one day, everything's finally done, and they realize they don't actually know who they are." The words landed harder than they should have, because Daniel felt them. Every syllable, like someone had reached inside his chest and described a secret he'd never spoken aloud. For a long moment, neither man said anything. The wind moved across the water. A duck splashed near the shore, and somewhere deep inside, a door Daniel had kept locked for decades began to creak open. Then Frank looked at him, really looked at him, and asked a question no one had ever asked before. A question Daniel wasn't ready to answer. What did you want before you became the man everyone needed you to be? Daniel didn't answer. Not because he didn't want to, because he genuinely didn't know. The question hung between them like fog over the lake. What did you want before you became the man everyone needed you to be? Frank waited. Daniel stared across the water. His first instinct was to laugh it off, to change the subject, to talk about retirement, grandchildren, the weather, anything except that question. But something stopped him. Maybe it was his age. Maybe it was the loneliness that had been growing inside him for years. Or maybe it was the uncomfortable realization that he couldn't remember the last time someone had asked him what he wanted. Not what he needed, not what he should do, not what others expected, what he wanted. Finally, Daniel shook his head. I don't know. Frank nodded as if he'd expected that answer. Most people don't. Daniel looked at him. What about you? Frank smiled faintly. I wanted to be a teacher. That surprised him. A teacher? Frank laughed. Hard to believe, right? You spent 40 years fixing industrial equipment. Exactly. The old man tossed another crumb into the water. My father worked at the factory. His father worked at the factory. Everybody expected me to work at the factory. So you did. So I did. Frank shrugged. Good paycheck. Good benefits. Good life. Then he paused. But it wasn't my life. The words settled heavily in Daniel's chest. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Frank stood slowly, his knees cracking. Think about the question. Daniel looked up. Why? Frank smiled. Because at 60, you've still got enough time left to answer it. Then he walked away, leaving Daniel alone beside the lake. Alone with a question that refused to leave. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The house felt larger after dark. Every room carried echoes. The hallway, the living room, Susan's favorite chair, the bedroom they had shared for 40 years. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, Frank's question looping endlessly in his mind. What did you want before you became the man everyone needed you to be? Around midnight he got out of bed. The rain had returned. Soft drops tapped against the windows. He wandered through the house until he found himself standing in front of a closet he hadn't opened in years. The one in the spare bedroom, the one Susan always joked, was his museum. Daniel hesitated, then opened the door. Dust filled the air, old boxes stacked from floor to ceiling. Forgotten pieces of a forgotten life. He pulled one down. Inside were photo albums. Another held old tax records. Another contained birthday cards. Then he found a flat cardboard box buried near the back. His name was written across the top, in Susan's handwriting. Daniel froze. Slowly he opened it. Inside were notebooks, sketchbooks, hundreds of pages. His hands trembled. He hadn't seen them in decades. For a moment, he simply stared. Then he sat on the floor and opened one. Pencil drawings, dozens of them. Buildings, people, landscapes, city streets, portraits, some unfinished, some remarkably detailed, all drawn by him. A younger version of him. A version he barely remembered. Suddenly he was 19 again, sitting at a small desk in his childhood bedroom, drawing late into the night, dreaming about becoming an illustrator, dreaming about attending art school, dreaming about seeing his work in books and magazines, dreaming about creating something meaningful. Then reality had arrived. His father got sick. Money became tight. A job opportunity opened at the manufacturing plant. Just temporary, he'd told himself. 1 year, maybe 2. Then he'd return to his dreams. Instead, 1 year became 5. 5 became 10. Then marriage, children, mortgage payments, responsibilities, life. The sketchbook rested in his lap. Daniel stared at the drawings, his chest tightening. Not because they were extraordinary, because they proved something. At one point, he had wanted something. Something deeply, something real. And he had abandoned it so completely that he'd almost forgotten it ever existed. He kept turning pages. Each drawing felt like a message from a stranger, or perhaps from someone he'd lost. Around 2 in the morning, he found a folded piece of paper tucked between 2 sketches. A letter, Susan's handwriting. His breath caught. He unfolded it carefully. The date at the top was 6 years old, long before her diagnosis, long before hospitals and treatments, long before goodbye. Daniel began reading, and within seconds, tears filled his eyes, because Susan had written something she'd never said aloud, something she'd apparently waited years for him to discover, a truth about him, a truth about their marriage, and a truth about the unhappiness he still couldn't understand. By the time he reached the last sentence, He was staring at the page in stunned silence. Outside, rain continued falling. Inside, Daniel felt as if the ground beneath his entire life had shifted. Daniel read the letter 3 times before he could fully absorb it. The handwriting was unmistakably Susan's. Neat, careful, gentle, just like her. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. Not because of age, because of him. The letter began simply, "If you're reading this, then you finally opened the box." Daniel let out a shaky breath. It sounded exactly like something Susan would write. She had always known him better than anyone, sometimes better than he knew himself. He continued reading. "You probably think this box is full of old drawings. It's not. It's full of evidence. Evidence of the person you used to be." Daniel swallowed hard. The words blurred as tears gathered in his eyes. "I know you don't talk about it anymore. But I remember when we were young. You used to draw everywhere. Napkins, envelopes, grocery lists. You saw the world differently. You noticed things other people missed. You were alive, in a way that made everyone around you feel alive too." Daniel closed his eyes. Memories surfaced. Him sketching Susan while she read books in college. Drawing city streets during lunch breaks. Filling notebooks during quiet evenings. Back when creating felt as natural as breathing. Back before life became a schedule. Back before every day revolved around responsibilities. He opened his eyes and continued. "You always told yourself you'd come back to it later. After work settled down. After the kids got older. After the mortgage. After retirement. There was always an after." Daniel stared at the page. The truth hurt because it was undeniable. His entire life had been built around postponement. Every dream deferred. Every desire delayed. Every passion placed on a shelf for someday. And someday had quietly become decades. Then came the paragraph that hit hardest. "Daniel, I don't think you've been unhappy because life was hard. I think you've been unhappy because you spent 40 years abandoning yourself one small piece at a time." His chest tightened. The room suddenly felt smaller. The silence heavier. He kept reading. "You were a wonderful husband. A wonderful father. A provider. A dependable man. Everyone who loves you is grateful for that. But sometimes I wondered whether anyone ever asked what it cost you." Daniel wiped his eyes. Susan never spoke dramatically. She wasn't the type. When she said something important, she usually said it quietly. And somehow those words always stayed longer. The next lines nearly broke him. "I loved the man who took care of everyone. But I also missed the young man who couldn't stop drawing." "I think you missed him too." Daniel lowered the letter. For several moments he couldn't breathe normally. His throat felt tight. His heart pounded. Because she was right. God, she was right. He had spent years believing unhappiness came from loss. From aging. From retirement. From grief. From things happening to him. But what if the source was much older? What if the emptiness had started long before Susan died? What if it began when he stopped being himself? The next morning Daniel drove to his daughter's house. Not because he planned to talk about the letter. He wasn't ready. He simply didn't want to sit alone with his thoughts. His daughter Emily opened the door. "Dad." She smiled and hugged him. "You okay?" The question caught him off guard. Emily studied his face. "What?" Daniel shook his head. "Nothing." She gave him the same look Susan used to give him. The look that said she knew he was lying. Inside, his grandchildren raced through the living room. 8-year-old Emma nearly knocked him over. "Took you long enough, Grandpa." Daniel laughed despite himself. The sound felt unfamiliar. Real. Emma grabbed his hand. "Come see my drawing." The word stopped him. Drawing. He followed her to the kitchen table. Construction paper. Markers. Colored pencils. The table was covered in artwork. Dragons. Houses. Dogs. Trees. Messy. Imperfect. Beautiful. Emma proudly held up a picture. "What do you think?" Daniel stared. Then smiled. "It's wonderful. Mom says you're good at drawing too." His smile faded slightly. "Your mom said that?" Emma nodded. "She said you used to draw all the time." "Used to." The words landed like a punch. "Used to. Not do. Used to do." As if that version of him belonged to history. To another person. To someone gone. Emma pushed a blank sheet of paper toward him. "Draw something." Daniel froze. A simple request. Yet suddenly terrifying. His fingers hesitated. He hadn't drawn in years. Not seriously. Not even casually. Emily watched from across the room. saying nothing, waiting. The pencil lay in front of him, ordinary, harmless. But Daniel felt something strange as he stared at it. Fear. Not fear of failure. Fear of discovering who he might have been. Slowly, he reached for the pencil, and for the first time in decades, Daniel Mercer began to draw. The pencil felt unfamiliar in Daniel's hand. Not physically. His fingers still remembered the weight, the balance, the slight texture of the wood. But emotionally, it felt like picking up an object from another lifetime. Emma sat beside him, watching with complete confidence. Children never questioned whether something was possible. Adults did that. Children simply expected things to happen. Draw a horse, Emma said. Daniel smiled nervously. A horse? Or a dragon? I've never drawn a dragon. Emma gasped dramatically. Then you've wasted your whole life. Emily burst out laughing from the kitchen. Even Daniel laughed. For a moment, something inside him loosened. The pressure, the heaviness, the constant awareness of age and regret. It faded just enough. He lowered the pencil to the paper. The first line felt awkward. The second felt uncertain. The third felt slightly better. Then something remarkable happened. His hand remembered. Not perfectly, not like it had at 20. But enough. Enough for instinct to wake up. Enough for muscle memory to emerge from somewhere deep inside him. The lines became smoother. Shapes formed. Details appeared. Within 15 minutes, a horse stood on the page. Not extraordinary, not professional, but alive. Emma stared at it with wide eyes. You made that? Daniel laughed. I think so. That's amazing. The word struck him unexpectedly. Amazing. Nobody had called anything he created amazing in decades. Because he hadn't created anything. Not really. He'd built a career, raised children, paid bills, maintained responsibilities, important things, necessary things. But creation was different. Creation left pieces of yourself behind. And looking at the drawing, Daniel realized how long it had been since he'd left any trace of himself anywhere. Emily quietly approached. She picked up the sketch. For a long moment, she simply looked at it. Then she looked at him. I forgot how good you were. Daniel swallowed. So did I. That night he couldn't stop thinking about the drawing. Not because it was great, because of how he had felt while making it. For 20 minutes, he hadn't been thinking about retirement, or grief, or aging, or loneliness. He had simply been present, fully present, the way people describe being during the best moments of life. Daniel sat in his living room, staring at the television. The screen was on. He wasn't watching. A realization was slowly taking shape. For years, he'd believed happiness was something you achieved, a destination, a reward, something waiting on the other side of enough money, enough security, enough success. But during those 20 minutes at Emily's kitchen table, happiness hadn't arrived from achieving anything. It had arrived from engagement, from participation, from losing himself in something meaningful. The thought unsettled him, because if it was true, then he had spent decades chasing the wrong thing. Over the next several weeks, Daniel began drawing again, quietly, privately, almost secretly, every morning after breakfast, every evening before bed, sometimes only 15 minutes, sometimes an hour. The old sketchbooks came out of storage. Dust-covered pencils were replaced. Blank pages slowly filled. At first he felt embarrassed, like a 60-year-old man playing pretend, like someone trying to reclaim a youth that no longer belonged to him. But the feeling didn't last, because something else was happening, something he hadn't expected. He was beginning to look forward to tomorrow. That realization shocked him more than anything. For years, tomorrow had felt identical to today, just another square on the calendar. Now there was curiosity, anticipation, a small but noticeable sense of possibility. Then one afternoon something happened that changed everything. Daniel visited a local art supply store, the kind of place he'd never entered during his working years. The smell hit him immediately. Paper, paint, wood, ink, creative energy. As he browsed, he noticed a flyer pinned to a bulletin board near the register. Community art exhibition. Local artists welcome. All ages open submission. Daniel stared at it. His stomach tightened. He almost laughed. Artists? That wasn't him. Not anymore. Maybe never. Still, he took a picture of the flyer, then immediately told himself he wasn't interested. On the drive home, he thought about it. By dinner, he was still thinking about it. By bedtime, he had memorized the submission deadline. And 3 days later, despite every excuse his mind generated, he found himself standing in front of the exhibition office, carrying one of his drawings. His hands shook, his pulse raced. The woman behind the desk smiled warmly. Submitting? Daniel hesitated. Everything inside him screamed to leave, to turn around, to avoid embarrassment, to stay safe. The same instincts that had guided most of his adult life. Then he remembered Susan's letter. You spent 40 years abandoning yourself one small piece at a time. The memory hit him like a wave. Slowly Daniel nodded. Yes. The woman handed him a form. He filled it out, signed his name, and submitted the drawing. When he walked back to his car, he felt ridiculous, and terrified, and strangely alive. For the first time in decades, he had done something with no practical purpose. No paycheck, no obligation, no expectation. Just because it mattered to him. But Daniel had no idea that the exhibition would lead him to someone who would force him to confront an even deeper truth. A truth that had nothing to do with art. And everything to do with the real reason he had been unhappy for most of his life. The email arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Daniel almost deleted it. He assumed it was spam, some automated rejection, some polite, "Thank you for your submission," that actually meant no one cared. But the subject line stopped him. Acceptance, Community Art Exhibition. His thumb froze over the screen. For a moment, he didn't open it, because part of him already knew what it would say, and another part of him didn't want to confirm it. Finally, he tapped it. Dear Daniel Mercer, we are pleased to inform you that your submission has been selected for display in this year's Community Art Exhibition. Daniel leaned back in his chair. The words didn't make sense at first. Selected, display, exhibition. He read it again, then a third time. His heart started beating faster. Not dramatically, not like in movies, but enough that he noticed it. Enough that it felt unfamiliar. The email continued. Your piece stood out for its emotional depth and simplicity. We believe visitors will connect with it. Daniel stared at the screen. Emotional depth. He almost laughed. If they only knew the truth. It was a drawing of a horse. A simple sketch. Done by a man who hadn't picked up a pencil in decades. And yet, someone had seen something in it. Something he hadn't even intended. That evening, Daniel went to Emily's house. He didn't call first. He just showed up. Emily opened the door, surprised. Dad? He held up his phone. I got in. Got in where? He handed it to her. She read the email, then looked up at him slowly. You're kidding. I'm not. Emma came running in. Grandpa. Daniel knelt instinctively. I have news. Emma tilted her head. What? My drawing is going in an exhibition. Emma gasped, like it was the biggest event in human history. That means you're famous. Daniel laughed. No, I don't think so. Emily was still staring at the screen. You submitted one piece? Yes. And they accepted it? Yes. She shook her head slightly. That's actually not easy. They reject most submissions. Daniel shrugged. I didn't know that part. Emily looked at him differently then. Not like a father who had retired. Not like a man who had lost his wife. But like someone she was seeing again for the first time in years. You should go, she said. Daniel hesitated. Go where? The exhibition. I don't know anyone there. That's not the point. He looked away. Old instincts rose immediately. Avoid attention. Avoid embarrassment. Avoid standing in rooms where you might not belong. Emily noticed. You're scared, she said quietly. Daniel didn't answer, because she was right. The night before the exhibition, Daniel barely slept. He lay in bed listening to the house settle. Every creak felt louder than usual. Every thought sharper. What if it looked childish? What if people laughed? What if he didn't belong there? What if this was all a mistake? At 3:12 a.m., he got up. He went to the spare room, opened the sketchbook, stared at his drawings, and for the first time, he noticed something different. They weren't just drawings. They were fragments of attention, of presence, of a version of himself that had not been buried, only ignored. He closed the book gently and made a decision. The exhibition was held in a renovated community hall downtown. Bright lights, white walls, quiet conversations, people holding drinks and discussing art. like they understood it more deeply than they probably did. Daniel stood near the entrance for a full minute before going inside. He immediately felt out of place. Too old, too ordinary, too invisible. Then he saw it. His drawing, framed, hung on a white wall. A simple horse sketch. Nothing dramatic, nothing flashy, but it was there. Real, displayed, seen. A small group stood nearby looking at it. Daniel drifted closer, but stayed at a distance. He listened. A woman spoke first. Something about it feels calm. A man nodded, like it wasn't trying too hard. Another voice added, "It feels honest." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Honest. He had never thought of himself that way. Not in decades. Then a young man beside them said something that stopped Daniel completely. "It looks like it was drawn by someone who remembers something most people forget." Daniel blinked, slowly stepped back. His pulse was loud in his ears, because that wasn't about the horse. That wasn't about skill. That was about him. Later, as the room filled with more visitors, Daniel stepped outside for air. The night was cool, quiet. He stood under a streetlight, hands in his pockets, trying to understand what he was feeling. Pride, fear, confusion, relief, all at once. Then a voice came from behind him. "You're Daniel Mercer, right?" He turned. A woman stood there. Late 30s. Confident posture. Calm eyes. The kind of person who observes more than she speaks. "Yes," Daniel said cautiously. "I'm Clara," she said. "I curate for the exhibition." He nodded politely. "Thank you for including my work." Clara tilted her head slightly. "I didn't include it because it was good." Daniel stiffened slightly. "Oh," she continued. "I included it because it looked like something that came from someone who had stopped lying to themselves, at least for a moment." That hit harder than anything that night. Daniel didn't respond immediately. For the first time in years, he felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with failure. Clara studied him. "You're not an artist," she said. Daniel nodded. "I know." She paused, then added quietly, "But you're becoming someone who finally stopped pretending he never was one." And that was the moment Daniel realized this wasn't about drawings anymore. It was about everything he had avoided confronting for his entire life. And someone else had just seen it clearly before he fully had. Daniel didn't sleep again. Not because he was anxious now, but because something had shifted too far inside him to ignore. Clara's words kept replaying in his head. Someone who stopped lying to themselves. It sounded almost simple when spoken out loud. But it wasn't simple. It was a demolition of identity, of excuses, of the version of himself he had carefully maintained for decades. The next morning, he sat at his kitchen table staring at nothing. The house was the same. Same silence. Same chair across from him where Susan used to sit. But he wasn't the same person sitting in it anymore. That was becoming harder to ignore. Around noon, his phone rang. "Emily. Dad, are you okay?" He hesitated. "I think so." That doesn't sound convincing. He almost smiled. "I'm not used to this." Used to what? Being seen. A pause on the line. Then Emily's voice softened. "You've been seen your whole life. You just didn't let it land." That sentence stayed with him long after the call ended. Because it was true in a way that hurt. People had always noticed him. As a worker, a husband, a father, a provider. But not as him. Not the part he buried. Not the part that drew. Not the part that wanted more than responsibility. He had made sure of that. That afternoon, Daniel returned to the exhibition. He told himself it was just to check something. But that was a lie. He knew why he was going. He wanted to see if anyone still looked at the drawing the same way. And more importantly, he wanted to see if he still felt the same looking at it. The hall was quieter during daytime. Fewer visitors, more space to think. He walked straight to his piece. It was still there. Still framed. Still simple. Still him. A young couple stood nearby discussing it. The woman spoke softly. "It feels like it was made by someone who lost something, but didn't stop noticing the world." Daniel stood just out of sight, listening. Something tightened in his throat again. Because they were describing something he had never been able to describe himself. Loss and attention. Not destruction. Not failure. Something more complicated. Something human. Then he heard footsteps behind him. "Clara, you came back," she said. Daniel didn't look at her immediately. I wasn't planning to. But you did. He nodded slightly. I don't understand why this matters so much. Clara stepped beside him. It doesn't matter because of the drawing. Then what is it? She looked at him directly. It matters because you're reacting like someone who hasn't felt recognition in a very long time. That landed uncomfortably close. Daniel finally looked at her. I've had recognition. For what? He didn't answer immediately, because the truth was obvious. Work, responsibility, reliability, not self. Clara continued quietly. There's a difference between being useful and being seen. That sentence didn't just land. It stayed. Later that day, Clara invited him to sit in a small cafe across the street. Daniel almost refused. Old habits. Avoid conversations that might go deeper than necessary. But something about her tone made him stay. They sat by the window. Rain started falling outside again. Clara stirred her coffee. You know what I think your drawing is? Daniel shrugged. A horse? She smiled slightly. No. He frowned. Then what? A moment where you weren't performing. That word again. Performing. Daniel looked out the window. Most of my life wasn't performance, he said quietly. Clara didn't argue. She just asked. Then what do you call it? He opened his mouth, closed it again, because the truth was uncomfortable. Most of his life had been structure, responsibility, expectations, roles, and somewhere along the way, he had stopped asking whether any of it aligned with him. Clara leaned back slightly. People don't usually become unhappy because they choose wrong things, she said. They become unhappy because they stop choosing at all. That sentence hit deeper than anything Susan had written, because it didn't accuse him, it explained him. That night, Daniel went back home and did something he hadn't done in years. He pulled out every sketchbook he owned, not just the recent ones, the old ones, the forgotten ones. He spread them across the living room floor, like evidence of a life interrupted. Hours passed. At some point, he stopped thinking in words and started thinking in images. Then something unexpected happened. He didn't feel regret. Not exactly. Regret implies wishing the past was different. This felt more precise. Awareness. Clearer. Sharper. He realized something simple and devastating. He hadn't lost his life. He had lived it. Selectively. And now, at 60, he was finally seeing the parts he had left behind. A life wasn't missing. It was incomplete. And that raised a question he wasn't ready for yet. If he started choosing again now, what kind of man would he become? And more importantly, was it too late to find out? Daniel stopped going to the exhibition. Not because he lost interest, because he was avoiding Clara. That realization annoyed him. At 60, he didn't expect to be avoiding anyone like a teenager. But he was. Because Clara wasn't just commenting on his drawing anymore. She was slowly dismantling the story he had built about his life. And worse. She was right. So he stayed home. He told himself he was taking a break. But the sketchbooks on his living room floor told a different truth. He wasn't taking a break from art. He was taking a break from truth. 3 days later, Emily showed up unannounced. She let herself in like she always did. Dad? He was at the table, staring at a blank page. She immediately noticed the scattered sketchbooks. You've been busy. I've been thinking. That looks like the same thing you've been doing for the last 40 years. He gave a small, tired smile. Fair. She sat across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Emily picked up one of the sketchbooks. Flipped through it slowly. Her expression changed slightly. Not surprise. Not admiration. Something more complicated. Recognition. I didn't know you still had these, she said. I didn't either. She looked at him. Why didn't you ever talk about this? Daniel exhaled. I told myself it didn't matter anymore. Emily nodded slowly. That's not the same as it not mattering. That line hit harder than he expected. Because she wasn't accusing him. She was correcting him. There was a difference. Later that evening, Emily brought Emma over. No warning. No explanation. Just a knock, and a small voice shouting, Grandpa. Emma ran in holding a notebook. I made something for you? Daniel smiled. What is it? A comic book. He opened it. Stick figures. Crayon drawings. A simple story about a horse that gets lost and finds its way home. Daniel stared at it for a long time. Then something inside him cracked open in a way that wasn't painful. It was familiar. Like something returning. Not new. just forgotten. You made this? He asked softly. Emma nodded proudly. Like you make your drawings. Emily watched him carefully, then said quietly, she thinks you're an artist. Daniel shook his head slightly. I'm not. Emma frowned. Yes, you are. You draw things. Daniel looked at her. You're an artist because you draw things? Emma nodded like it was obvious. Yes. That simplicity broke through something he had built over decades. All his life, he had complicated everything. Titles, worth, identity, proof. And here was a child reducing it to something undeniable. You draw. So you are. That night, after Emily and Emma left, Daniel sat alone in the kitchen. The house felt different now. Not emptier, but louder, like it was asking questions again. He finally stood up, grabbed a pencil, and walked outside. The air was cool, the sky clear. He sat on the porch steps and began sketching the streetlight across from his house. At first, his hand hesitated. Then slowly, it found rhythm. Lines formed, shadows appeared, light became shape. For the first time in years, he didn't think about whether it was good. He didn't think about whether it mattered. He just did it. And something strange happened. Time stopped feeling like pressure. It started feeling like space. When he finally finished, he looked down at the page. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And that was enough. A voice behind him broke the silence. I see you didn't quit. Daniel turned slightly. Clara stood at the edge of his driveway. He hadn't heard her arrive. You followed me? He asked. No, she said. I just know people like you. He frowned. People like me? Clara stepped closer. People who only almost live their lives. That sentence hit harder than any before. Daniel stood slowly. I'm not sure I understand what you want from me. Clara studied him for a moment. I don't want anything from you. A pause. Then, I think you're finally in the part of your life where you have to decide whether you'd cheer. That's what going to disappear again. Or finally exist. The words hung in the air. Heavy. Unavoidable. Daniel looked down at the sketch in his hand. Then back at her. For the first time, the question wasn't theoretical. It wasn't philosophical. It was immediate. And it demanded an answer. Because whatever came next would define the final chapter of his life. Daniel didn't answer Clara right away. Not because he didn't hear her. Because for the first time in his life, he understood that answering would mean commitment. Not to her, not to art, but to himself. And that was the part he had avoided for 60 years. The streetlight buzzed softly above them. A dog barked somewhere down the road. Life continued as if nothing important was happening. But Daniel knew better now. Something was happening. Something irreversible. Clara looked at him calmly. No pressure in her expression. No persuasion. Just observation. That made it worse. Because she wasn't trying to convince him. She was waiting to see what he already was. Daniel finally spoke. I spent most of my life doing what I was supposed to do. Clara nodded. I know. I don't even remember when I stopped asking what I wanted. Another nod. That happens when you become useful to everyone except yourself. The words landed, but this time they didn't break him. They clarified him. Daniel looked down at the sketch in his hand. The streetlight drawing. Simple. Imperfect. Real. I don't know if I'm an artist, he said quietly. Clara replied immediately. That's not the question. He looked at her. Then what is? Her voice softened slightly. Do you want the rest of your life to be another version of the one you already regret? Or something you actually participate in? Silence. Long. Heavy. Honest. Daniel's throat tightened. Because he finally saw it clearly. The mistake had never been one big decision. It had been thousands of small absences. Moments where he didn't choose. Moments where he delayed. Moments where he told himself, later, and later, had quietly become most of his life. He sat down slowly, on the porch step. Clara remained standing. For once, Daniel didn't feel judged. He felt exposed. And there was a difference. After a long silence, he spoke again. I don't think I can fix what I missed. Clara shook her head. You can't. That honesty stung. But it didn't destroy him. She continued. But you can stop missing what's left. That sentence hit deeper than anything Susan had written. Deeper than anything Emily had said. Deeper than anything he had realized alone. Because it didn't ask him to repair the past. It asked him to live the present. Days turned into weeks. Something changed in Daniel. But not in a dramatic way. There were no sudden transformations, no cinematic reinvention, just consistency. He drew every day, not to prove anything, not to impress anyone, just because it felt like breathing again. Emily noticed, then Emma noticed. Then neighbors started noticing sketches pinned quietly inside his window. Small things, a porch filled with sketches, a quiet presence that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, Emily sat with him on the porch. She looked at the drawings spread beside him. "You seem different," she said. Daniel didn't look up. "I don't feel different. You look less gone." That made him pause. Less gone. He understood what she meant. For years, he had been physically present but internally absent. Now, something had returned. Not youth, not lost ambition. Something simpler, attention. The exhibition came and went. Daniel didn't attend this time, but one of his sketches was featured in a small local gallery afterward. Not because it was the best, but because someone said it felt honest enough to matter. Clara didn't tell him. He found out later by accident. And for the first time, he didn't rush to define what it meant. He just accepted it. Quietly, without needing it to become more than it was. One evening, Daniel sat alone on his porch. Sunset painting the street in warm gold. He held a sketchbook in his lap. The same hands that once built a life of obligation were now drawing a tree slowly losing its leaves. Emma's voice echoed in his memory. "You're an artist because you draw things. Simple. Wrong in technical terms. True in every meaningful way." Daniel looked up at the fading sky and finally understood what Frank had meant at the lake, what Susan had tried to say in her letter, what Clara had pushed him to see. He hadn't been unhappy because life failed him. He had been unhappy because he had slowly stepped out of his own life. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just quietly enough that he didn't notice until it was almost over. Almost. He closed the sketchbook gently. Not like an ending. Like a continuation. Because for the first time in decades, Daniel Mercer understood something simple. His life wasn't something he had already lived. It was something he was still living. And now, finally, he was inside it.